Okay. Um, so yes, if your users tick yes, then you can obviously then check the findings and um, get the rest of the information from them. And also then you have some people that you could sort of, yeah, just um, contact and maybe invite to further testing later on. Obviously, if the answer is no, then you shouldn't. You really shouldn't do that. Then you get marked as spam, and then all sorts of terrible things um, happen after that. So first of all, user experience and playtesting. Some general questions we can go through later on. They're already phrased in a way that sort of leave the question itself rather open ending. It's not the questions are meant to be as um, neutral as possible, so that you don't lead the player into thinking anything. But then, yeah, from I think that's the scale that's most important then. Um, and you can obviously customize these questions based on the type of game that you're making. So there if the consistency in the world isn't, well, that kind of applies to everyone, but if it's not a really a goal driven game, then perhaps again these things are quite high level. They're not very specific to any particular mechanic, but if you need that to be in there, you need to add those questions to your questionnaire. But I think there's quite a lot to go on here already. um, just go to the next one real quick. It's unfortunate that this formatting doesn't stay as consistent. I see it depends on the size of um, your outcome that drives the spacing of these things. That's the kind of stuff that drives me absolutely crazy. Um, the sort of formatting inconsistencies, because it creates sort of visual clutter. So now you've got like this thing happening again, where it would have been great if all of them could have just been in line and you can just go like tick 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 tick. Now you already have to, but hey, this is the tool that we have to our disposal. So I suppose yeah, you can't really change the font size or anything on there. I don't know how and what the workaround for that would be. um, okay, right. Player experience, engagement, enduring play, um, gameplay experience, rewards, entertainment value, immersion, emotional connection, narrative. So yeah, we're testing for like a wide spectrum of. Oh, I don't actually even need to fill it in. I can just go through it. So I suppose that's also fine if people do get annoyed with the process. They're not forced to like fill out everything, and then they can submit it and sort of you'll um, if you duplicate. I don't know how many of you have worked with forms or haven't worked with forms before, but if you create a copy of the form, you should be able to tell it where these responses are being recorded. So at the moment, um, it's accepting responses, and then you can tell it where to save that spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet is actually what's going to give you a lot of insight and information. Normally the kind of I suppose, was it even, this form doesn't allow you to see the results afterwards, but now I've got one response and I've got these kind of findings, but they're not particularly useful. I mean, they're sort of okay. I think when you have a few more, you can kind of get a general idea of what the impression of your game is. But I do think you need to go and look at sort of the spreadsheet information to get a better idea of what is actually happening there. Um, So by default, um, it doesn't create a spreadsheet, but it does sort of save in a temporary space. But once you click create, then it will create a spreadsheet for you, and now you have some actual data that you can then you know do something with and compile. So you can then work out averages for each one of these components. In here, these questions are maybe a little difficult um, to see exactly what's going on there, but I do believe that you're welcome to like go and tweak this, so you can then go and set some headings for the spreadsheet, um, and I think that you should be able to then carry on. Let me just see, it is accepting responses. Let's just do another quick response here. And Bill and Joe, or what is it, Melinda at Microsoft. She would definitely want more information about this game. Okay, so if we just sort of pick some random ones where we can test information on. Okay. Right. So now we should have another entry already, and as you can see, it doesn't affect the top tier or top layer. Of the sheet, so, or of the responses, so you can still work with this. I wouldn't go and change the existing names of those categories, because I think that's kind of how Google keeps track of where to place the information. And also, if you've changed the form afterwards, then other things are going to start appearing here. You can also, I suppose, once you've created a high level sort of navigational menu, you can hide these rows if they don't make any sense to you, and you can just reformat. And there's some nice ways of then creating graphs from this information in spreadsheet format, but yeah, it's kind of like a nice to have and not really that essential. So cool. Alright, so I'm sharing this playtesting template with you. Cool. Then I had another look at some of your UX walkthroughs and stuff, and I have some questions here and there. So I'll go through that in a minute. And then I've been playing around with shaders and Cinemachine and the animator. So I've got some like little snippets of work. I can show you some technical stuff. Just create. But it'll be cool if you guys can also just as we go through your games, tell me what you're busy with. Tell me if there's anything that you need help with. That's general feedback kind of stuff. Yeah, I was spamming you this morning a little bit. There's a bunch of tutorials that I came across, and sort of intros to approaches in making depth shaders, so sort of faking geometry where there isn't any, um, and movement and stuff, and also just playing around with some shader stuff. I had a look at what Jared was doing um, in UI, and we had to do something similar for virtual window where we had a yeah, I don't know if that's in the latest version. Can I have a quick look? Um, Maybe running three versions of Unity isn't such a good idea. Yeah, okay, I'll get back to that one. So we had to transition between the sort of the different factions in Virtual Window, um, where each faction, and this was sort of uh, done as a an afterthought kind of thing, that we wanted to create these sort of characters for each school without we didn't really want to explicitly just use the colors, and perhaps not include stuff like visual communication and film arts and creative technology inside the virtual world, because it's a virtual um, version of the real world. We felt like we want to sort of deviate a little bit from that, making more of a fantasy world than just a pure clone of whatever's happening in real life in any case. Um, so we tried to create these sort of characters, and the characters were made sort of in line with what kind of things are happening in those schools in any case. So we thought, like, well, I thought um, the kind of like Roman approach is very structured and very organized, and much more like the um, kind of design ethos. Film takes long, so you need to be hardy, and but there's also sort of that element of the Norse gods and things that are in line with kind of like Viking traditions, that makes it seem a little bit chaotic. Like the medium as well can be quite erratic. Uh, uh, these guys can sort of like with Native American spirit animals and shapeshifters and that kind of stuff. I thought because CT is always adapting and trying to keep up with the trends. Um, and we make magic, so so that was the thought behind it. But just using the colors were a little bit uh, sort of obscure if you're looking, or not clear enough. So in the past we did this little animation where um, sort of each school, and this is sort of just like thinking about stuff. It's not final design, but kind of like where each school has a type of a shape, and then we tried to represent these shapes in the world, and they ended up being quite odd, and also doesn't really allow for a lot of camera movement. So these are just sort of like issues and thinking that we ran into when designing UI elements for Virtual Window. Um, so before, all the sort of faction elements were kind of pre-rendered, and they would kind of pop up and float above the head of the character. Um, so that's, I suppose it's kind of cool, and you do have that depth element. but it was a little bit confusing, and also because you're in the latest version that we have. Also, not sure if this is going to run so well while recording everything. Uh, we have a web build going on. Um, that's yeah, it still needs some love. So spawns your character. Oh, the UI elements are removed from that, but because of the fact that the camera kind of changes perspective, um, there there's an issue with the way that the UI is being approached, because those 3D little elements that we used to float around the head were kind of fine for single perspective, but the moment that you move, then they start sort of going wonky or flat, or because of the perspective change, don't seem like they fit just right. Um, and also we want to run on web, so it needs to be um, it needs to be quite lightweight. Um, yeah. What is the hotkey for switching animation frames in Windows? So this is what we also do, is like when we work on stuff, and if you haven't done things in a while, you also have to like um, go to the manual and find out things. So like you're not alone if you feel like sometimes you don't know how to do something and you need to just go and look for it, because we do that all the time. It doesn't matter how proficient we are at anything, you always like um, unless it was like the last thing that you just did, then you can just carry on doing it the same way. But um, whenever whenever you're stuck with any technical issue, even if it's something like a shortcut that you forget, just ask, go check the manual, go and figure it out. Um, okay, so back to this, and it's not particularly novel or anything. I just thought it was sort of a fun exercise to um, go and take that, the typical procedural polygon shader that comes with the standard shader examples, um, and expose some additional variables on that. So just by making um, or adding a rotate node to that, and making sure that it has alpha clipping and whatnot, but exposing these variables so that you can have fun animating them. um, you can very easily just, you don't always have to animate in here. I know that you can do sort of procedural animation and have things change shape over time, but what's also nice is just exposing some of those variables and actually tapping into them in the um, either using some external code, or simply just animating these things. So if I go to my animator window or animation window, it still shows this because none of the values have changed. But the moment that the animation kicks in, um, that changes to the shape that you animated it to be. So you can do kind of like motion design type stuff in um, in Unity, right? So by just um, looking at the curves on the animations and just sort of like targeting the parameters of your shader, you could do a super lightweight version of something that would have been normally a couple of hundred sprites or keyframes. Um, yeah, so just making things lighter, making them slicker. This is probably something that you'll encounter in any case. Like we we did a lot of sort of sprites and sequences for the original virtual window, and then we started seeing, the effect. Like you don't notice the effect with like one instance of sprite sheets or two, but like if your entire game is running on it, then you're gonna start feeling it drag down the frame rate, and have to start thinking of ways um, to optimize your game. Just make sure that it runs on the platform that you intended to run on. So then you have to come up with like clever ideas of how to, um, you know, reducing the footprint of it. So yeah, this is just it was a fun little exercise, and I think with the way that curves are currently working in Unity, you can just have a lot of fun with the animation and just make it. Let me just see here. This doesn't allow me to change the right tangent. Okay. Anyway. So the same kind of stuff, and I think came across some other stuff. I think Christian came across a repo recently. I think he sent it to me, that, or a guy's website that also does sort of these shader tricks to make uh, other things like liquid simulations even, seem like there's liquid in something when there isn't actually. It's just a sort of a shader trick, by keeping the normal of the shader consistent. Sorry, where was that? He did share it on another chat with me. Yeah, we're looking into the introduction, or the um, rigging preview package, but also I think Jared mentioned the Kinematica asset that was also recently released. It may be of some interest to you, but obviously it's going to uh, ripple into some R&D stuff if you're not familiar with it. But what it essentially does is, it, you, instead of making blend trees and parameters for the way that the character interacts with the world, you give the character a set of animations that it can do, and then you um, basically tell it to figure out what it needs to do. You still set certain parameters, but you don't have to build blend trees, which is a weird way of looking at animation. They demoed this in 2015, it seems. Uh, in 2018, it sort of became a little bit more viable, and then again disappeared off the scene. And now we're seeing sort of more motion synthesis stuff coming out this year again. Um, it's it's very interesting stuff. It's kind of, it's bleeding edge. So if you get into it, then um, it's kind of on you to make sure that you can deal with um, the shortfalls and um, potential issues. But yeah, so here's sort of some behavior graphs, or task graphs as they call it. Um, yeah, I haven't played enough with that. Anyway, the actual thing that I wanted to show you. So here's just the dude's website dealing with some shader code. and he's got, well, some lightning stuff and whatnot, jellyfish, water shaders, whirlpools, portal shaders, but so some liquid shaders, and he goes into quite a bit of depth on how to set those up. So that's a cool resource to have a look at. Cool if you're doing all. I think might be a couple of you that are doing liquids inside objects, so that might be an interesting approach to that. All right, and if you move the object, then obviously it stays, in line with gravitation, or simulating at least the gravitation of it. So the other thing that I also wanted to speak to you about is starting to create an awareness, especially if you're doing user playtesting. People tend to want to see some sort of a front end for your game. Now, I'm not talking about a blog or anything. I think it should be more of a landing page rather, kind of like what we're doing for things like virtual window as well. I lost the site there. So in this case, the virtual window page is literally just a landing page that kind of describes what the game is about, but also something that I haven't put here, or something that we've actually taken out, is also the support button. It's because that used to say closed beta, so I need to add that. But it just gives you sort of a general feel and idea for the game, and kind of just um, validates its existence to some degree. Like, because something has a website, it feels like it belongs. I don't know how to explain it otherwise, but I know, like, if I am looking for a sort of a service delivery company, or even a games company, and I can't find a homepage for that game, then um, or that service, then it feels like there's no accountability. Like, you can't reach out to them, and I also hate those websites that sort of give you no way of contacting them, or reaching out to them. So um, you need to try and set something up like that, so that people can also, like, just refer back to it. And um, if you're whether you're running a sort of a Facebook or Twitter, or whatever social media you're using to make people aware of your game, if at all at this stage, um, you always need a kind of a homepage for those people to refer back to, and just, again, just make sure that it's a real thing. So there's a number of ways that you can obviously go about this. This is just a WordPress hosted website on a server that we have running for virtual windows. So that costs some money to run, but, like, not a massive amount. It's something like to register a domain is less than $100 a year, and then the hosting depends on the amount of traffic that you're expecting and the amount of files that you want to upload. But there's also, some additional expenses. You can use free site builders like Wix and whatnot. They normally add quite a bit of spam to your site. So the other option would be to create a Google site. So there, Google Sites has updated a little bit since we last used it. Or there's a new version and there's a classic version currently. And you can you can create some pretty good looking websites. So this was I don't think it was ever published, but it was an idea to create a sort of a front end for a booking system, and for our cameras and our controllers. And yeah, you can change the layout of things, you can add all sorts of content to it. The published version doesn't obviously have any of that stuff in it, so it looks like a legitimate site for most part. It will obviously have a URL that includes the um, some reference to Google sites. Let me just see. Here's a student example. I know you guys love those. All right, so a student from last year. Now this feels a little bit more like a blog. Um, you don't necessarily want um, your general public to kind of see all of your planning documentation. I think it needs to be more sensationalist, if you know what I mean. Like you want to show things that kind of show off new development aspects of your game. So like cool things that are happening. Like if this thing was rigged and moving around a little bit, or um, you want to post a GIF of some progress or one aspect. It needs to kind of like be just more accessible and um, not nearly as technical. You don't want the general public to necessarily have insight into your um, development or thinking processes. Rather just kind of your development progress, but not the process, if that makes sense. Um, so yes, then the site looks like this, and it'll say Google Sites virtual window, and have a particular URL. You can obviously redirect people to this if you want to. It's some sort of web-based front end. Seems legit. So yeah, you're welcome to use this. But if you want to use any other front end um, for your game, then please do so. I am going to add this as a sort of a by the way to your spreadsheet, so you can add that. Let me just go back here. And let's do a social channel as well. This can be reduced somewhat. Right. So that people can check out, and I think it's going to be important, especially because of the playtesting not being available, or you not being able to get into contact with the actual people that are playtesting your game. So there's a component called it doesn't get any bigger than that. Okay. So setting, like plan the location, facilities and hardware, software equipment required, like webcams, headphones, controllers, etc. For people testing your game, but that's only if or when possible. I know that this is not particularly possible at this stage, but because you can't create a physical setting for your game, I think creating a virtual one um, is really important. So that social link or that front end website becomes like a major um, contact point for you and your playtesters, or anyone interested in your game for that matter. Because what you would like to happen, ideally, is that the candidates that you've selected are so excited about your game that they would sort of tell their friends and expand on your demographic, and then kind of have people that are opting in for testing, and then the whole kind of hype around your game drives itself, and that's a really awesome motivational tool if you can get people excited about something that you're working on, because then you're not just doing it for yourself anymore, you're doing it for other people. um, so yeah, it's really cool if you can get that ball rolling. Cool. The other fun thing that I was playing with, and I've seen in some of the UX um, examples, that the controllers and cameras and characters and things are still, well, in some cases, are still very um, sort of early onset kind of elements. And I know that you still obviously need to work on those to polish them, um, and I can appreciate that. We go through the same processes of like testing things and um, checking out how they work. But I was looking at something for, well, uh, both for virtual window, but also for um, the VR game. And I'm trying to think if there are other ones like this. Um, so the Cinemachine free look camera allows you to set up a type of a rig um, for the camera itself, so you can kind of see the rig, kind of, maybe not. Um, so you'll see these sort of darker lines that make up the rig of the camera, and then if you look closely you could also see um, the curve that links those sort of lines. What it's doing is it's creating um, three camera orbits that you can specify the height for. Now the free look cameras automatically use um, the X and Y values to orbit around your character, but these are just getting that information from the input manager in the first place. So you can go and change the values that it needs to take into account for its navigation. You can also drive these values in other ways if you choose to do so. Um, so for instance, if you wanted to swap this out with a right mouse button click, then you could remove that input axis name and you could simply drive the axis value programmatically. Um, Setting certain parameters for that value to actually be fed into the system. But what's very nice about this type of rig system is you can set a different configuration for every um, step of the way. So you can have a different lens over here, so a more orthographic lens when it goes into a sort of a top-down view. You can have different framing, you can have different culling for different ranges, and it just makes navigation, um, well, so much. There's some awful jaggediness at the moment, and I don't know if that's just the update happening. Everything seems to be lagging a little bit at the moment. Is is my voice also lagging? Yeah, my frame rate is also really terrible. My internet speed should be fine though. I'm recording and I have two Unities open, and I have other things. It's a couple of things happening at the same time. My computer is hissing. Okay, so yeah, just sort of playing around with different systems. Like I said, it's kind of like a process where you need to decide what you want to do and what approach you want to take to something, and then just kind of like research that particular aspect and dive into it, and like see what you can get out of it. And if you get stuck, then that's why we're here, so we can help you and sort of try and tackle the problem with you.